The moment crowds heard the Supreme Court had upheld President Uhuru Kenyatta's election rerun victory. Minutes earlier, the Chief Justice had quashed 2 petitions challenging the October polls, saying they lack merit.
The presidential election of the 26th October is hereby upheld, as is the election of the 3rd respondent.
The 2 cases have clearly taken their toll. But the president's team is looking ahead.
It's good for the country now that this phase will come to an end, and the agitation, the tension about election, and all this now is over. The court agreed with our case that really there was no case in the first place.
But not everybody agrees. On the streets, while ruling party supporters are celebrating, opposition supporters are reflecting.
Many people are offended, like me, I'm offended, and I will only feel free after Uhuru called Raila on a 2-people table to tell Raila a serious issue which can make his people to calm down.
I'm very happy because since last time...
I'm happy because when the election was nullified, a lot of things stalled. The economy is bad, counties have not received money, and there is a lot of insecurity.
So shida imekuwa mingi sana na pia insecurity.
Mimi nimefurahia sana.
I am happy because my right to vote was taken into consideration.
Nimeona ni kweli wametufikiria sisi.
Opposition leader Raila Odinga, who had challenged the first election but boycotted the rerun poll, is currently out of the country. He's promised to issue a statement on the opposition's next step upon his return. With the court upholding Uhuru Kenyatta's victory, this now paves the way for him to be sworn in. That event scheduled to take place in a week's time. But Kenya's political crisis is far from over. He faces a huge task unifying the country. Robert Nagila, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Well, let's get you some perspective on that developing story. I'm joined in studio by Dr. Njoki Ngumi. She's a political commentator and learning and development coordinator at NEST and HEVA Fund. Dr. Ngumi, thank you for joining us on Africa Live. Kenya today. Spectacular day here for the country, though the Supreme Court has upheld the election results. Well, it's been dragging on for months now.
Right.
Is that an end to it?
In as far as us having a president legally, yes, but then there are several things that we've not dealt with. We've not dealt with the issues that people had with the electoral process. We've not dealt with the internal issues at the IEBC, which then become by default the country's whole internal issue. And obviously we've not dealt with the massive divides that Kenyans have found that we always experience low-key, but now become high-key during a time like this.
Well, you know, there's been some violence, so to speak, some unrest in some parts of the country, particularly the opposition strongholds there. Now, opposition leader Raila Odinga, what does he need to do, though, to bring a closure to this, or to bring people together, or to take the country forward, so to speak?
I feel as though the work of bringing the country forward shouldn't rest on Honorable Odinga alone. It rests with all Kenyans. The first thing that we need to say is that the violence we've seen is not necessarily only in opposition strongholds. We've also seen state violence, and there needs to be a strong statement by the state itself and even by Honorable Raila himself about it. The second thing is that the violence that we've seen has impacted the most marginalized and the most vulnerable people the very most of all. So we've seen women being sexually harassed and children. We've seen the poor disproportionately being killed. And we need as a nation to mourn our dead and just kind of regroup and ask ourselves what has brought us to this very moment. And then Raila Odinga has the job now of kind of solidifying the national resistance movement around the fact that we don't really have an electoral issue as far as the law is concerned anymore. And so now trying to figure out what that means for the resistance. And then NASA had begun the whole conversation around secession, and there was a bill that had been tabled. And so now we are going to have to talk about that without the shadow of election hanging over us.
All right, but when we look at it from President Uhuru Kenyatta's position as well, this has been a very polarizing election, not just the last 2 months, but even prior to this electioneering period itself. It has been quite polarizing. So how much unifying does the president have to do? What is the president going to do to ensure that the country is unified? And how difficult is this going to be, given the fact that actually Raila Odinga's party or coalition had about 6 million voters in the last election on the 8th of August? How difficult is this going to be for President Kenyatta?
We need to realize that we're dealing with a fatigued population. There's so many people who are so tired with everything that's been going on. Remember, at the same time that the business environment and the environment in which people are able to make income has really been struggling. Again, during times like this, we forget to look back at the sky and remember that we live in a natural environment. And so the weather has been shifting. We don't really have the hold on agriculture and the hold on the food basket that we usually do. And we're going to have to start talking about that. So there's many things going on in as far as that's concerned. Again, the work of mourning our dead is not the work of Honorable Odinga alone, because it is not just his people who died, even though disproportionately they did. And I feel as though, if we're going to be honest, His Excellency the President is going to have to say something about that. He's also going to have to say something about the state violence that we saw. We saw live bullets being used during what should have been peaceful protests. We have seen peaceful protests also during this time, but they have been the exception and not the rule. And so we have to figure out as a country, how do we go ahead with disagreeing politically without it having to become physically violent. But the physically violent times we have been living in, we have to allow people to feel their feelings, whatever those feelings may be. People who want to celebrate, they must have room to celebrate. People who want to mourn, right, and people who did not have the result from the Supreme Court and the president that they wanted have to be allowed to mourn as well. And then when we now have a time when the emotions are not running as high, when the air is not as inflammatory as it is now, then we can begin to have the very important conversations, especially about economic inequalities and about areas that have been economically marginalized for so long, and with a history of this economic marginalization.
Right, Dr. Njoki Ngumi, we'll leave it there for the moment, but thank you very much for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me.